Thanks very much for inviting me to speak today. Very happy to be here. I survived the drive. It wasn't too bad, just very cold, but winter, hey. A little bit about me. So I am new to this program. Last January, I was just hired as the on-farm network agronomist. So my role is, or what I'm responsible for, is the design, execution, and reporting of MPSG's network of farm research trials. So I thought I'd start off by talking about what the on-farm network is. We've kind of got an idea of what it is, I'm sure, if you're here and familiar with the on-farm research that is done in Minnesota, or with the wheat here. But our on-farm network may have a few differences, so I thought I'd start there. So it's our in-house research program for field-scale trials with MPSG, and we've noticed that on-farm research holds a lot of value. One reason being that it combines real working farms with scientific methods and research specialists. There's often a gap in science and academia and reality. Small plot research absolutely has its value. It's what sparks a lot of our on-farm trials, but we're asking a lot to expect it to coincide with the variable landscapes that you see and the growing regions that make up our reality. So at the on-farm network, we try to bridge the gap between research and real life, while still holding true to scientific methods and adding power to our results with statistical validation. And we do this with farmers' fields, farmers' equipment, and farmers' practices. So since 2012, we've hosted 462 trials over 11 seasons with 180 producers. And this was done in our 4 different crop types, which are soybean, field pea, dry bean, and faba bean. 80% of our trials that we've conducted have been with soybeans. And what we look at on the on-farm network really varies. Trial types are various between the different crop types, but this is a list of the ones that we've worked with so far. So some of these are just a one-off trial, whereas others continue to build into a much larger data set. All of the trial types have been focused on the farmer and something that they're interested in discovering or trying. And we also started running economics in 2020, which added a lot of value to our trial results. We did this to determine if the yield differences that we were seeing between treatments were enough to offset the costs of those treatments. So these highlighted trial types in the soybean and dry bean categories are the ones that I'm going to be talking about today. So soybean seeding rate, soybean fungicide, double inoculant and row spacing, as well as dry bean fungicide. Unfortunately, I don't think I have enough time to talk about more dry bean trials in this presentation, but if you have any questions about something that you see on this board here, by all means you can reach out and contact me and I'll help you out with answering your questions. So I'm going to jump right into soybean seeding right here. So the objective of this one is to quantify the agronomic and economic impacts of different seeding rates on soybean production. Our main questions that we're looking for are, can we reduce input costs? And what is the effect of seeding rate on yield? There's a caveat written below there in small print. This is traditionally done with 3 different seeding rates. Start at the standard practice that the farmer is interested in trying, or typically uses, I should say, followed by 30,000 seeds per acre higher and 30,000 seeds per acre lower than their standard practice. And we do this to make sure that the seeding rate or the treatments are different enough from one another to establish different plant stands and to observe any agronomic or yield differences between those treatments. So this is the longest running and the most popular trial type that we have had with soybeans, or even across the board, in fact. We've had 107 trials completed since 2012. 19 of them have been significant, which I'll touch on more in a moment. We've looked at many different seeding rate combinations depending on what the farmer is interested in looking at and who is hosting these trials. So this is a graph showing the distribution of seeding rates that we have looked at across time. And it's ranged from about 100,000 seeds per acre to 226,000 seeds per acre. The 2 most popular comparisons that we get are 130 versus 160 versus 190,000 seeds per acre, which falls into this range that's shown in green. And we also get a lot of 150 versus 180 versus 210,000 seeds per acre, which is shown in orange. Those are our two most popular treatment comparisons. And what we've learned across time in our trials is that most often seeding rate does not have a significant effect on soybean yield. This is important to know because it can have big implications on how much your seed costs will be in the spring. And so of those 107 trials that we've looked at, those 19 of them that were statistically significant, it's shown here in the orange and the red, that's 18% of the total trials. And of those, of that 18%, 12% of those were significantly, were economical, I should say, 12% of the time, at a market price of $12 a bushel. This meant that we didn't have enough of a yield increase with seeding rate to, or that we did have enough of a yield increase with seeding rate to offset the costs of seed in the spring. So 88 of the trials, or 82% that is shown in green here, have not shown a response to yield. Now, it's really important in these trials to discuss survivability. We record plant counts at an early vegetative, or V stage, and a late season reproductive, or R stage. This helps us determine the percentage of plants that survived, or survivability, through time. So this table's a little bit busy if you haven't seen it before, but the leftmost column is the number of times that this particular rate has been counted across the years that we've done this trial type. So for example, 130,000 seeds per acre has been looked at 34 different times in our network. And then we're looking at this comparison that I mentioned, the 130 versus 160 versus 190, one of the popular comparisons that we like to examine in our network. So when we look at the survivability from plant stands recorded at the V stages, which I've highlighted here, you can see that the survivability is decreasing when seeding rate increases. Again, survivability at the R stage is showing a very similar thing. It's decreasing with higher seeding rates. So between the V and the R stages, what this means is that the 130,000 seeds per acre rate saw a survivability difference of 3% all the way to a difference of 6% at the highest seeding rate of 190,000 seeds per acre. And we look at the comparison of the 150 versus 180 versus 210,000 seeds per acre. That's that second most popular comparison that we like to look at. We see a similar effect. So survivability is decreasing with increased seeding rates across the board, up to a 8% difference at this highest seeding rate here. So this brings us to our key takeaway messages from what we've learned across the network, though this is subject to change as our data set grows over time. What we're learning and what we're seeing is that over 200,000 seeds per acre doesn't seem to make sense. We're noticing that somewhere around the 150 to 180,000 seeds per acre range should be adequate enough to achieve full soybean yield potential, which is shown in the green shading on the graph here. That's pretty much where this yield is plateauing. So that's what our data set's telling us right now. But we're going to continue to explore this as we investigate more trials and establish more. So moving on to soybean inoculant trials. We actually do two different types in the on-farm network. We do a single inoculation versus no inoculation, and we do a double inoculation versus a single inoculation. And I'm just going to talk about the double inoculation today. So the objectives of this one are to quantify the agronomic and economic impacts of seed applied inoculant versus seed applied plus in-furrow inoculant in soybeans. We also want to examine the effect of double inoculation on nodulation, the seed quality, and on yield. This helps us decide if doing a double inoculation practice is necessary and worth it, and if you even need to apply the just-in-case application. Now, there are some caveats to our inoculation trial types. Rhizobium is not native to our Manitoban soils, and we have to introduce it with the practice of inoculation. So we ask that fields hosting this trial have a history of at least 2 years of soybeans before we decide to establish this trial type. Because before we decide to reduce our inoculation strategy, we need to make sure we have a history of well-nodulated soybean crops so that we build up that rhizobium in soils. So these trials were first done in 2013, and we've had 49 trials to date, 3 of which were significant. And one of the ratings that we collect in this trial are nodulation ratings. So this is our rating scale on the left here. We look at plant growth and vigor, nodule number, and nodule position. The nodule position indicates if the rhizobium are coming from the inoculant itself that we've applied in the upper layer. You'll see more nodules near the crown roots, whereas if it's coming from the soil, you'll see more nodules from the lateral roots. So moving into the yield results and what we've noticed across time here. So this graph is showing the 49 double inoculant trials that we've had with a proper field history, sorted by year on the bottom here, and yield on the y-axis. So paired bars, the dark blue and the light blue, those indicate they represent rather, the double versus the single inoculant treatments. And we've only had 3 significant yield increases, which is shown in the green bars that are highlighted here. And that's only 6% of the time. So this could tell us that in many of these instances, the fields may have enough rhizobium to reduce inoculant treatments in the future, but we'd like to see more data added to this, especially because some of these trials are from the eastern side of Manitoba, which is where a lot of our soybeans are grown, and it would be nice to see some from the western side of the province, where fewer soybeans are grown, and see if that helps encourage soybean adding soybeans into rotations, especially on the western side of our province there. So MPSG developed a checklist of 4 criteria that a field should meet before switching from double to single inoculation. The field should have seen at least 2 previous soybean crops. There should have been a soybean crop on it within the past 4 years. Previous soybean crops should be nodulated well, and there should not be any significant flooding or drought on those fields. Definitely important factors to consider before switching inoculation strategies. So I'm going to move into soybean row spacing here. Just like the other trials, row spacing is dependent on what comparison the grower is interested in, but also what their equipment is capable of doing. So we don't calculate economics for this specific trial type. There's just too much variability with equipment costs, and it's very difficult to quantify that. The objective of this trial is to quantify the agronomic impacts of different row spacings in soybeans. And in this trial type, we look at canopy closure at 3 different stages, so R1, R3, and R5. And we do this using an app on our phones that helps us track canopy closure. The expectation is that narrower rows will lead to faster closure and more closure compared to wider rows. We also examine the effect of row spacing on yield as well. So this is a newer data set. We've just started doing row spacing trials in 2019, so not very long ago, and we've done 19 of them so far. And before I get deeper into the yields, I'd like to clarify some row spacing terminology. So broadly speaking, we consider narrow rows to be anything under 15 inches or so, and wide rows to be anything over 15 inches or so, where intermediate is kind of the middle ground between those two. So I've listed some row spacings here that fall into those categories for our trials and how we classify them. Sorry about this microphone, I can't figure out how to get it to not be so noisy. So when I'm talking about narrow versus intermediate, I'm talking about 7.5 versus 15-inch rows, as well as 10 versus 20-inch rows. And when I'm talking about intermediate versus wide, I'm talking about 15 versus 30. So this is what our data set looks like across time. On the left-hand side of the graph here, kind of split in the middle, we have 9 different trials here comparing narrow versus intermediate rows, and 10 trials on the right-hand side comparing intermediate versus wide rows, or 15 versus 30 inches. The green bars, like I showed on the other graph, mean that there is a statistical difference in yield. Now, the interesting thing about this, you'll specifically notice that the lighter green bars on the left-hand side, all of those had increased yields, and those lighter green bars are the narrower treatment of the two treatments. So overall, encompassing this entire graph, 32% of the time, soybean yield has increased as a result of narrower row widths. To break it down a little bit further, in narrow versus intermediate trials, the one here on the left, we've seen a significant response 44% of the time, which is shown in green, and that's in favor of narrow rows. This gave us an average yield difference of 1.8 bushels per acre. And in the intermediate versus the wide trials, which is the pie on the right, we've seen a significant response 20% of the time, which is shown in green. And that's for an average yield difference of 2.1 bushels per acre. So we're still continuing to build this data set, and it is new, but our data is so far showing that narrower rows benefit yield. Moving on to soybean fungicide. So this trial, the objective of this one is to quantify the agronomic and economic impacts of a single foliar fungicide application in soybeans. And we're interested in learning what the effect fungicide has on disease pressure, seed quality, and yields. So we've helped establish 66 soybean fungicide trials since 2014. And at each trial, we conduct a disease rating to examine incidence and severity. So we have rating scales ranging from 0 to 5 for powdery mildew, septoria brown spot, white mold, and downy mildew. And then we do a presence and absence rating for the rest on the right there. So anthracnose, bacterial blight, frog eye, phomopsis, stem canker, and phytophthora. The fungicide product that's used varies depending on what the farmer wants to apply. So the last trial we did of soybean fungicide was actually in 2020 because it was very dry in 2020 and 2021. And there was little interest in fungicide applications as a result. But we have done 66 trials between 2014 and 2020, 10 of which had a significant positive yield response, ranging from 0.7 to 2.2 an acre. Now, after several years of soybean fungicide trials, we're seeing that soybean fungicide doesn't frequently pay in terms of a yield benefit. It's only been significant 15% of the time. But moving forward, we're hoping to assess the frequency of yield responses with positive economic outcomes because we just started doing economic analysis and haven't had a chance to really run that through on more recent trials due to the lack of interest in doing these trials. So hopefully we'll learn from more wet years down the road. So on this similar thread, I'm going to transition into dry bean fungicide results. The objective of this is very similar to the soybean fungicide. We're looking at the agronomic and economic impacts of foliar fungicide applications in dry beans. We're checking out the effect of disease pressure or on disease pressure. We're looking at the effect on seed quality and the effect on yield. The interesting thing about this trial type is that we've only had one significant trial to date. So we started this trial in 2016. And we've done 17 trials to date with only the one significant response, which was actually from this year. So we wondered why, since 2016, have we not seen a significant yield response in the other trials? And if we look at these specific dry bean fungicide trial locations, so this is every single location that we've done. This is actually only up to 2020. And we examine the cumulative average precipitation for both the actual and the normal precipitation at those locations, so actual being yellow bars and normal being the blue bars. You'll notice that we only had 2 sites where the actual rainfall was close to or exceeded our normal rainfall. So furthermore, there was also very minimal white mold pressure at those sites. So the environmental conditions may have been conducive to disease development at these sites, but the disease prevalence that was needed to get any high enough disease pressure and see a significant benefit from fungicide application just wasn't there. But I did mention 2022 was the first year that we saw a significant effect. So this was T9905 navy beans on 30-inch row spacings, and they applied Lance WDG at R2. And yield significantly increased in the single application of fungicide, as you can see here. It actually increased 175 pounds per acre. with the single application. And we do rate for diseases in this trial type as well. So we rate for anthracnose, both foliar and stem, and we rate for white mold in our dry bean trials. But interestingly, there was no disease pressure observed in this trial at all, which was really odd and interesting to notice. So we dove into a little bit more. And when I look at this precipitation table, what I see is there was a lot of precipitation in May and July. So May actually had 238% of our normal precipitation, and in July we had 154% of our normal precipitation. The crop was seeded on May 28th, and then it was sprayed on July 23rd at R2. And then the disease rating was done in August, about mid-August. So it looks like there was great conditions for this disease, but there might be a bit more to this story. So on July 22nd, this is the day before the fungicide spray, I had a student go out for a rating, and they found all of the beans to be dried off and kind of shredded looking. Not really what you want to see in your field ever. And this was, like I mentioned, the day before the fungicide spray. So to me, this looks like bacterial wilt. And the student also reported seeing bacterial blight in this trial as well, which is not controlled by Lance, which is the fungicide that was applied at this trial. So we all know diseases love to get into plants at any opportunity they can possibly get, whether that be from hail damage or sandblasting or some other type of environmental damage, insect feeding, whatnot. So even though anthracnose and white mold weren't visibly observed, I theorized that something was still able to enter the plant at this stage. There's clearly some damage on the plants here. The entire crop looked like that. But due to that spray at R2, and perhaps due to the lack of rains in August, which was 46% of our normal rains, we saw that yield difference in fungicide-treated beans. That's my going theory at the moment, but there may be more as I investigate this crop type further. So we know that weather, cropping history, disease history, all of these are things to take into consideration with fungicide applications, and it's hard to anticipate what will happen throughout the year. So with any fungicide application, we're doing it in anticipation of not really knowing what's going to happen throughout the year, and we're going to continue to examine these trials down the road to try to learn more and understand them. So that was a crash course in just a few of our trial types on the on-farm network. I wanted to speak a little bit about our trial reports because they can be kind of useful to look into, and they are available to the general public. So at the end of the season, we run some stats and we create these trial reports on every one of our trials. The reports include agronomic information which is relevant to the trial, as well as any other data collection points that were gathered through the season, like precipitation, plant stands, nodulation ratings. It varies from trial type to trial type, but those are also found on the report. And we like to include NDVI images for any visual analysis. Sometimes you can see some pretty funky stuff going on in the trials, and it's good to have that NDVI imagery to examine it, and maybe it can help explain some results further. Yield statistics are also included in the charts depicting different treatments that were involved in that trial. And on the second page, we include the treatments and their respective yields that were found. We include results from the statistical analysis here as well. And in 2020, we also started to calculate the economics, as I mentioned, to determine if treatments were economical or not. So using cost estimates that come from Manitoba Agriculture, which is an online resource that we use. It's published every February or so. We use that as a resource, and we also use word of mouth from staff that's talking to farmers and industry professionals to calculate our economics and use it to compare cost values. So if the trial wasn't significant, we just calculate the cost difference between the treated versus the standard practice and detail if there was an economical benefit or not to the treatment. But if the trial did have a statistically significant yield difference, we do a little bit more work. So we calculate cost, which is shown here on this left side, as well as the change in profit from the long-term averages to the current conditions. And we did this because in the past few years, as I'm sure you've all been privy to, there's been a heck of a lot of fluctuation with seed costs, fertilizer costs. It's been pretty wild. And so it's important to consider because things do change quite a lot long-term versus current conditions. So all of our reports can be found on our website. I have the link at the top of the page there. And you can follow that link and it'll take you to our database, which covers all of those trials that I've mentioned. So here you can scroll through them all and you can sort them by the crop up here and the trial type as well. And you can pick as many as you'd like. They'll basically pop up as pins on this map. And if you click on any pin at any point, you get a little bubble pop up. And you can click on the link here, and it'll take you to those reports that I just mentioned. So that's across the whole network. You can see it across Manitoba. It's really nice to look into to see what exactly happened through different years and with different trial types and different crops. It's just another way that we like to share our results and knowledge with growers. So one final thing I want to mention too before I wrap up, we do have a resource called the Guide to Conducting On-Farm Trials. And I did leave some of these at that table over there if you wanted to grab some today. And it talks about the value of doing on-farm research and how you can establish trials on your own without a research specialist being involved. So I did bring some of those, and you could for sure grab some. They're also, this is online. Everything that I've showed you is online, so not too hard to find. But in general, so as more years pass, we're really looking forward to finding out what else we can learn on the On-Farm Network program. And there's lots to learn, I'm sure, as you could see with the list of trial types that we've looked at. There's tons of stories there that we could get really deep into, but no time today for that. But you can find it all online. So at the end of the day, what we've learned is that it's really about farmers' fields and farmers' results. If you want to get a hold of me in some way, you can send me an email or you can text or call me, but that is a Manitoba number, so be aware that you might get charged out the wazoo if you do that. And if you want to learn more, you can go to our website, like I've mentioned a few times now. It's manitobapulse.ca/on-farm network or on-farm research reports to go to that database and learn more about our trials. So thank you again for inviting me to speak today.